Hi everyone, this is Dr. Johnson, and for this particular lecture, we're going to be talking about child nutrition. We're specifically going to be talking a lot about the National School Lunch Program and the school breakfast program. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to describe the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. You should be able to list the requirements for a reimbursable school lunch meal. And you should be able to create meals that comply with the dietary standards according to the National School Lunch Program. Let's get started. I first want to lay the foundation when we're looking at grade school kiddos, what the importance is of nutrition. Hopefully by now you've been able to identify how nutrition is correlated with health. Here are some stats from 2018 for grade 5, 7, and 9, specifically in California. This is the percentage of students who are considered obese. You can see that grade 5, there's 40.5% of the population is considered obese. In 7th grade, 39%, and in 9th grade, it's 37.3%. This is quite alarming because the majority of children who are obese when they're younger will maintain obesity into adulthood and then gain even more weight. So let's look at some statistics related to nutrient-dense foods. I always like to look at it from a perspective of healthy, nourishing foods. So let's see how well students in this age range are doing with drinking less sugary beverages. So here are the stats for California. So this represents the percentage of children who are drinking one or more sugar-sweetened beverages per day. So these are things like soda, lemonades, etc. You can see that the majority of overall the population is consuming 40% of children are consuming one or more sugar-sweetened beverages per day. There's really no nutritional value when we look at sugar-sweetened beverages, so it's important that we can decrease the amount of sugary sweetened beverages that kiddos are consuming in order to help decrease obesity. Now, if you look in the San Diego region, you can see that we're doing pretty well in comparison to other parts of the state. If you were to pause this for a second and think about why in these areas where it's a really dark blue, so that means a higher percentage of the population, of the children is when I'm talking about the population, are consuming 50 to 60% of the children are consuming at least one or more sugary sweetened beverages per day. What do you think is going on in these particular areas of the states? If you guessed a low SCS status, you're on the right track. Traditionally, it shows that children who grow up in households with a low SCS have higher rates of poor diets, and we would classify children consuming one or more sugary sweetened beverages as a poor diet. Now let's look at the fruits and vegetables. So this is again by age. So the dark blue represents children who are 2 to 11, and then the yellow represents children who are 12 to 17. So we're also kind of jumping into that teen years. So this particular stat shows the children who eat 5 or more servings of fruits and vegetables per day. Now, it's important to understand that the recommendation minimum per day of fruits and veggies is 5 servings throughout the day. Now, this is adjusted for age group because a 2-year-old is not going to be able to eat 5 servings of what an adult would have. So their portion size and serving is according to their particular needs, which we'll be learning more about later. You can see that less than a third of our children are meeting this recommendation. Fruits and vegetables are loaded full of nutrients that can help decrease obesity, decrease other chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, which is heart disease. Therefore, what we want to do is create healthy habits with kids. There's a couple of different avenues that we can do, and I like to just mention these main brief bullet points as we move forward to then discuss the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. So first and foremost, good nutrition starts at home. It's important for parents to be the role model because children look up to them. I also love this Bible verse, Proverbs 22:6, where it says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Now, granted, the Bible is talking about our spiritual relationship with the Lord. However, I think it's applicable as well. We want to be able to teach our children that food is not about perfection, and there shouldn't be a rule when we're looking at foods. We should also not label foods as good or bad. We want to make sure that we can understand our child's food preferences and set realistic goals. So yes, there is room in a child's diet for what we would call, quote, kid foods, or I like to call them play foods. So things like Rice Krispie treats. Now granted, we don't want that child to eat Rice Krispie treats all day long, every single day. However, we should be able to build that in with a balanced diet of healthy foods like fruits and vegetables. With that, we can provide our children with confidence. We want to make sure that we can build confidence with their food selections at home. So then when they go over to their friend's house, they know how certain foods make their bodies feel. This is important because a lot of parents, out of good intentions, restrict or don't allow, let's say, sugary foods or fast food in the home. However, as soon as you let that kiddo out of the house and they're at their friend's house who has that sugary food, they're going to binge eat it and get as much as they possibly can because it's not allowed in their home. So this is when it's important to have those boundaries and provide a balance. You should be reading this week about Ellen Sater, and one of her principles talks about the division of responsibility. This is essentially saying that as a parent or a provider, you have the responsibility to offer the child choices, but the child also has a choice on what they're going to consume or what they're not. So let's get into one of the largest acts that overhauled the school lunch program. This is called the Healthy HungerFree Kids Act. It was enacted in 2010 by Michelle Obama as First Lady, and it was effective beginning in 2012. The Healthy HungerFree Kid Act is a requirement from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, which mandated an update to the nutrition standards provided in school lunch programs. For those of you that are unaware, the school lunch program is a service that is offering foods to children who come from income-based homes that need assistance with their food, and then also for children who come from affluent homes and just want to have a hot lunch at school. What exactly did the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act change? Well, we'll get into those details in just a bit. I want to first give you a little bit of background. The school lunch program has been around since 1946. It's a federally funded program that gives cash reimbursements for the number of lunches served in public schools. They are to provide nutritious meals to all children, but specifically to reach those who are in need. For some kids, their only meal that they get throughout the day is the lunch provided to them at school. The idea behind the lunch program is that lunch is supposed to meet 1/3 of the age group's daily nutritional needs. For example, if you required 900 milligrams of calcium per day, the lunch should be providing at least 300 milligrams per day. Another requirement is that 1 to 2 ounces of protein per meal, and there are more specific requirements for each of the meal components, or what we could also call food groups. I'll be referring it to as meal components moving forward. So the National School Lunch Program requirements, this was a crazy time. I actually worked in the school district when these new standards were put into place. It was a huge overhaul because now there was very strict requirements on what was allowed and what was not allowed. Previously, fast food companies or like these big chocolate chip cookies, I remember when I was in school, they were able to be served, but that no longer is allowed according to the National School Lunch Program. According to the National School Lunch Program, there must be 5 meal components offered for school lunch. In order for it to be reimbursed, so essentially the government has funded the program for that meal, the student is required to take 3 out of the 5 meal components. One of them has to be a fruit or a vegetable. So let's briefly talk about what was the overall change with the National School Lunch Program. The National School Lunch Program is required to meet the dietary guidelines of 2015-2020. It should note that we will have new dietary guidelines in 2020 that will impact and make the schools make additional changes depending on what is updated. With that being said, the two biggest pieces with the dietary guidelines of 2015-2020 was that less than 10% of our total calories are allowed to come from added sugars, and then less than 10% of our total calories can be coming from solid fats or saturated fats. This largely reduced and limits the amount of foods that are offered with the school lunch program in order to comply. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the breakfast program. What I'd like to do is go through each of these 5 components and talk about what is allowed and what is not allowed. This is important because these are the same guidelines as the CACFP, which is the infant and toddler daycare, which you will be doing a menu for a preschool activity. So let's look at the meat and meat alternatives. So the meat and meat alternatives include any foods such as meats like beef, nuts and seeds, beans, tofu, eggs, cheese, and yogurt. Now, I want to point this out, that cheese and yogurt are considered a meat alternative, not a milk. That's very important because the requirement is for school lunch program, you must provide fluid milk in order for it to count as that meal component. We'll get more to detail about that later. Now, I want to show you that there are different requirements for the different age groups. This was another update to the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. The Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act put a max amount of calories allowed for each grade level. So grades K through 12, grades 6 through 8, and grades 9 through 12 all have different requirements. The idea behind this was to help combat the obesity epidemic with children. By limiting the amount of calories that they are consuming, it can help offset the overconsumption of calories down the road. One thing to note, it does not benefit those who rely exclusively on a school lunch as their sole calorie intake for the day. That was a big debate when the new guidelines came out. We'll talk about some alternatives that they help bridge that gap for those kiddos. So let's look at the requirements per day. So grades K through 5, they're required to have 1 ounce equivalent per day. For grades 6 through 8, it's the same. But grades 9 through 12, they're required to have at least 2 ounces per day of a meat or meat alternative. You can see that within the week, they're required to meet a little bit different depending on the age group. But we'll focus on the daily requirements because you're going to end up writing a menu for practice. Grains. Now, the meal component grains, this was a huge undertaking and a huge overhaul. So the new guidelines state that all grains must be whole grain or whole grain rich. Let's talk about that. So this includes things like whole wheat bread, whole grain bread, whole wheat pasta, oatmeal, brown rice, etc. So when we're looking at the grain component, for example, a tortilla on a burrito is required to be a whole grain tortilla. Now, the reason for this implementation is to increase the amount of fiber and nutrients that that child is consuming. Whole grains have been associated with lower obesity and lower risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. You can see that each day, K through 8 requires 1 ounce equivalent per day, and grades 9 through 12 require 2 ounces equivalent. Now, you may be asking yourself, what does equivalent mean? And I'll be posting another mini lecture on figuring out how do you know how much pizza or how much burrito 1 ounce equivalent would be. This was a huge undertaking. Now, there was a phase-out period where they were allowed to have 50% whole grain and 50% enriched. However, this is now transitioned over the last 5 years to be 100% whole grain. The reason for that, again, as I mentioned earlier, is to boost the fiber and nutrient content of the overall diet. This required a mass undertaking from producers. The food companies that would make these burritos or pasta or pizza for large quantity food production had to completely reformulate their product in order to comply to these new guidelines. Now, with the fruits and vegetables, this was a very interesting undertaking. They really push the requirement for fruits and veggies to increase. And this is because we know of all the health benefits behind fruits and vegetables, and children are largely not consuming the adequate amount. You can see that fruit and a vegetable are each their own meal component with different requirements. So K through 12 and grades 6 through 8 require at least a half a cup of fruit per day. Grades 9 through 12 require 1 cup per day. Where the vegetables, grades K through 8 K through 12 both have 3/4 cup minimum of vegetables. Now, one thing to note that's very interesting is that the veggies have to vary by color throughout the week. So there are now basically 5 categories of vegetables. They can fall in the dark green category, the red and orange category, beans and peas category, starchy category, and other. So let me give you an example of each. A dark green would be broccoli. A red or orange would be carrot. Beans and peas would be kidney beans. Starchy could be a potato. And other could be cucumbers or bell peppers. But also, bell peppers could fall under the red and orange category. Now, there is a minimum requirement each week that they have to offer in order to get a variety of colors of vegetables throughout the week. They can no longer just serve French fries as potatoes throughout the week. In addition, fruit has to be in the form of whole fruit, and if they are going to offer juice, it has to be 100% juice. It can't have any added sugars in it, and no more than 50% of the offerings throughout the week can be juice. For example, there's 5 days in the week. If they had fruit juice for 3 out of the 5 days, that would be too much. So you're limited to only serving fruit juice 2 days of the week. Now let's talk about milk. Milk was really interesting because, as I mentioned earlier, milk must be a fluid milk. You also have to offer 2 different choices of milk. Now, originally, they removed flavored milk completely. So there was no longer chocolate milk and there was no longer strawberry milk ever offered. It simply was either non-fat milk or low-fat milk. However, they started to notice a large amount of fluid milk waste in schools, so they reintroduced the flavored milk. However, flavored milk must be non-fat, so it can't be low-fat chocolate milk. It has to be non-fat chocolate milk. Referencing here that non-fat and fat-free are the same thing, and then low-fat and 1% are the same thing. Students are not required to take the milk. However, they do require to offer fluid milk. Now, one thing that's interesting is that they only offer milk alternatives to those who have a registered allergy. It's not based off of food preference. So what exactly counts as a reimbursable meal? Students must take at least 3 of the 5 required meal components. One of them must be a fruit or a vegetable. Now, what's the issue with this? When they first implemented this in 2012, there was a large amount of food waste, specifically thrown away fruits and vegetables, because there was no education that went along with providing these new meals to children and letting them know, hey, we're going to increase the amounts of fruits and vegetables because they help you build strong bodies. A lot of education went into teaching kids how to make a healthy lunch, specifically by choosing their entree, choosing at least 1 fruit or vegetable, and then selecting the milk option. Again, the reimbursable meal requirement only mandates that children take 3 of the 5 meal components, and one of them must be a fruit or a vegetable. So a meal is not complete without a fruit or vegetable. Juice is considered a fruit, but it must be less than 50%. They don't have to take the milk, and lunch does have to offer all 5 meal components. An entree is 2 components, which typically includes the grain and the meat, and a student must take a minimum of 3 of these meal components in order for it to be compliant. I want you to pause the video and I want you to design a lunch that appeals to children using the 5 required meal components. Then I want you to write a brief little lesson on how, oh, sorry, it should say meal, not snack. Uh, what what nutrients would you find in those foods to have a healthy nutritional benefit? And then brainstorm some type of fun food game that you could create an educational lesson plan around.